This lecture is going to cover material that pertains to chapter 14 and 15 in your textbook. The three things, though, that I want to specifically focus in on are the Medici family, the Neoplatonism that is important to some of the philosophical background of this time period, and a really interesting pre-Reformation kind of reformer by the name of Savonarola. So, the Medici family, which is a very fascinating family that I guess really you would call somewhat of a dynasty. If you looked up their actual family tree and saw how far and wide this family stretched through Renaissance Europe and into all parts of Europe, honestly, it's really quite interesting. Something about this particular family, that they were very influential, very powerful. The Medici family was, from this time period between the 13th and 17th century, very closely associated with the Renaissance and cultural and artistic revival that we see from this time period. They produced three popes, Pope Leo X, Clement VII, and Leo XI. Numerous rulers of Florence that we'll talk a little bit about, some of them. Lorenzo il Magnifico, to whom the Prince by Machiavelli is actually dedicated to. And there were later members of French and English royal families that come from this family line of the Medici. So the Medici family rose along with the merchant class in Florence. By the end of the 13th century, a member of the Medici family was a standard bearer for the city. Salvestro de' Medici, who lived from 1331 to 1388, led a revolt, became dictator of the city for a short time, and then most of the Medicis were banished from politics for their involvement in plotting for revolt, and their fortunes suffered. However, the Medici family rises to prominence under Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, 1360 to 1429. Now, he was the son of a poor widow. Giovanni took a job working in a bank owned by his cousin, and eventually opened his own bank known as the, Medici Bank. Very clever name. In Florence in 1397. So, banking becomes the family's main professional success, with several family members controlling their own branches as well. Money brought the Medici family power, and much of the money in the Medici Bank came directly from the Catholic Church. Giovanni de' Medici banned loans to princes and kings who were prone to defaulting on their obligations, and instead focuses a substantial amount of the bank's funds to the papacy. So he decides, the Catholic Church has money. We'll put our focus on the Catholic Church, and we'll work with them as they borrow from us, and we make, interest on the loans, and there just becomes this really interesting sort of economic system built between the Medici family and the Catholic Church, the papacy. So by 1434, more than half of the Medici wealth came from the Medici Bank in Rome, which of course is where the Vatican is. The Medici Bank's role as the papal bank brought new accounts, including the incomes of cardinals, archbishops, and bishops, and the like. Each branch of the Medici Bank operated as a franchise, making money not only for the Medici financial empire, but also for the individual bank operators. So over time, Giovanni gained control of all the Medici-owned banks, managing 26 banks by the time of his death in 1429. At the time of his death, the Medici family was the third richest in the city of Florence. Giovanni had a strong circle of supporters, friends, and friends of friends, and he left his son Cosimo de' Medici, who lived 1389 to 1464, prepared to create an empire, and that he does. The Medici were the most powerful family in Florentine affairs for 76 years. from 1418 when they became banker to the papacy until 1494 when irate citizens removed them from power. They were briefly exiled for earlier for the year of 1433, but in the long haul of everything, they pretty much maintained a financial power and presence in Florence. In the 15th century, they were a banking family with offices in Pisa, Rome, Bologna, Naples, Venice, Avignon, Lyon, Geneva, Basile, Cologne, Antwerp, Bourges, and London. Now, they never outright ruled Florence, but they were managing its affairs from behind the scenes. So, money is power, right? So, if you control the money, you pretty much control the government. This kind of works in the same way we see with modern-day constituencies, with giving money to certain organizations and political organizations in order to achieve a political end. Money has power. Money can control the politics. Over the course of those 76 years, they basically pulled the strings of Florence, trying to produce the city they wanted to see. As the book states, the city of Florence was a work of art they hoped to manipulate. They instilled a fierce, independent spirit that backfired. The people rebelled against the Medici eventually. The family's power was cemented by Cosimo de' Medici, as I said, 1389 to 1464. He was the banker to the papacy. This helped secure Florence's dominion over Siena. This put Florence at the center of Italian politics. He inherited great wealth from his father, and he secured political holds on the city. He influenced appointed offices. He exerted considerable influence through his patronage of the arts. He foot the bill to restore the church of San Lorenzo and to decorate it. This embodied the whole of Christian history in Florence. This site was dedicated in 393, considered a very important icon, a very important historical site concerning Christianity at the time. That is the Church of San Lorenzo. The Medici family crest was the only one allowed to even appear in that particular church. He rebuilt the old monastery of San Marco for the Dominican order, added a library, a cloister, chapter room, bell tower, and altarpiece. Cosimo appropriated the whole of Florence's religious history and made it the Medici's. Estimates that, he spent about $40 million in trying to restore the Christian sites and the churches here, San Marco and San Lorenzo. Cosimo also surrounded himself with humanists, though. So, yes, he had an investment in Christianity, the Catholicism of the day. But, of course, he was also very interested in humanism. So he collected ancient Greek and Roman art. So whenever we say humanist, at this point, at least in the terms of the Renaissance, which means the rebirth, right? We're looking back to the time of the Greeks, the time of the Romans, looking at how they did art, the texts that they wrote. He collected and actually commissioned the translation of many Greek texts. Cosimo was impressed by one particular scholar, Marsilio Ficino, 1433 to 99. So in about 1453, Cosimo supported Ficino in his translations and interpretations of the works of Plato, right, Greek, and later Platonic philosophers. He translates the Greek to the Latin, and which, of course, Latin was the common language of the Catholic Church and Catholic Europe at the time. And then so we see this kind of bringing to the surface of Platonic thought, kind of revived, relived through the work of Ficino here. Just to give you a little bit of a breakdown, some things about Plato, some Platonism. For one, there's two spheres. So the sphere of being that is eternal and unchanging, right? And then you have the sphere of the world in which we actually live, in which nothing is fixed forever. Ficino conceived it his duty to harmonize Christianity and this kind of pagan dualism, this pagan tradition. It inspired Cosimo who ends up founding the Platonic Academy in Florence. So under Ficino's direction, they gathered in this suburban villa, which included Cosimo being involved, to sit around and talk about Plato. And inspired by Plato's work Symposium, it was Ficino who coined the term Platonic love. So if you've ever said, oh, it's just a platonic relationship, we're not in love, we're just friends, right? Well, that's where this comes from. If you've ever said, we have a platonic relationship, you were being philosophical. Means that you're spiritually akin, you have a connection on a deep level, but it's not sexual. Now, we have to also talk a little bit here about Plotinus. Now, this is a little different than Plato, often may be confused if you hear the terminology, but Plotinus was the source of Ficino's thought. And in his study of the writings of Plotinus, who actually existed somewhere around 205 to 270, Greek philosopher of Platonic thought, who studied Indian philosophy, so he brought in Hinduism and Buddhism into kind of a Plato philosophy, believed in this ineffable, transcendent, capital O, one, the O-N-E, the one. Basically, all the universe emanated from the one in the form of lesser beings. Plotinus is considered to be the founder of Neoplatonism. Taking his lead from his reading of Plato, Plotinus developed a complex spiritual cosmology involving three foundational elements. So the first one is the one we just mentioned, which is the one, capital O, the intelligence, and the soul. So this would be the Trinitarian Neoplatonist view. The one, the intelligence, and the soul. It is from the productive unity of these three beings that all existence emanates, according to Plotinus. So the principle of emanation is a little complicated, but let's give it a shot here if we can try to unpack this idea. It's not simply like the cause, right, of everything in existence, but it's also contemplative in itself. So the concept of emanation is that all derived or secondary things proceed or flow from the primary. So from the source, we have this all, encompassing one, that from the one all things exist. And so I guess we would really say the one is God. But instead of thinking of it as in terms of creation, like God creating everything, emanation, and that's spelled E-M-A-N-A-T-I-O-N, differs a little bit because all things are made to emanate according to natural laws without conscious volition. This differs from the theory of formation at the hands of God or a supreme artisan who finds his matter ready at his hand. Now, whether actually or only apparently material, everything flows from the primal principle. So it's different from creation in that all things are made to emanate according to natural laws and without conscious volition. So it's not like there was an intelligent designer, right? And so it also, the emanation differs in that there was no, hands of God forming things. Everything is emanating on its own from the one, not in an intelligent way, not in a creative way, but it's also not like evolution, which you might think, well, that sounds like evolution. Emanation holds to the immutability of the first principle as to both quantity and quality. What that means is that the original place of emanation, from which we all flow, from the one, that itself does not change, right? And then that would be different in our concept of evolution, being that forms transition, but not the original emanating form. It's the one, and it's unchanging. It'll never be more than one. It was always one. It will always be what it is and nothing more. Now, if you think this is confusing, it's because it is. So don't worry. So also in the tendency of the development evolution, there's the implication that something goes from less to more perfect, right? So this doesn't do that because emanation involves a series of descending stages. So it goes from the perfect to the imperfect, which is backwards when it comes to evolution, which would say we're coming from a lesser, undeveloped form to a greater, more developed form. So in his system, Plotinus raises intellectual contemplation to the status of a productive principle. So it is by virtue of contemplation that all existence, that's us, or anything and exists, are said to be united as a single, all-pervasive reality. In this sense, Plotinus is not a strict pantheist who thinks God is in everything. Yet his system does not permit the notion of a creatio ex nihilo in Latin, which means creation out of nothingness. Plotinus' doctrine of the soul is also a little bit complicated. So the soul is composed of a higher and lower part. The higher part being unchangeable and divine, and really aloof and distant from this lower part, yet providing the lower part with life. So that seems a little contradictory, but that's Plotinus' doctrine of the soul. So while the lower part is the seat of the personality, where we find passions and vices, the lower part is provided with life from the higher part. So this led him to kind of neglect an ethics of the individual human being in favor of a mystical or soteric doctrine of the soul's ascent to union with its higher part. The philosophy of Plotinus is represented in the complete collection of his treatises, collected and edited by his student Porphyry into 6 books of 9 treatises each. So the quote-unquote concept of the one, capital O, is not, properly speaking, a concept at all. Since it is never explicitly defined by Plotinus, yet is nevertheless the foundation and grandest expression of his philosophy. Plotinus does not make it clear that no words can do justice to the power. Let me fix that. No, he does make it clear that no words can do justice to the power of the one. Even the name, the one, is inadequate, for naming already implies discursive knowledge, implying that we can even talk about it. So this kind of, you can see the Eastern influence here in Plotinus, because if you recall, when we talked about Taoism in this class, we talked about the Tao, which is the way. And the way is kind of undefined. In fact, if we're talking about the way, we probably don't know what the way is. So if you're talking about the one, capital O, you probably don't know what it is. So as we sit here and listen, well, you listen and I talk, I'm bringing up a concept, trying to explain it to you, that Plotinus would say, the fact that you think you can even talk about it shows that you don't really know what it is. So even to try to apply a name to something that you can't name, it divides and separates objects to make them intelligible, but the one cannot be known through the process of discursive reasoning. Knowledge of the one is achieved through the experience of its power, quote unquote, what we call in the Greek dunamis, and its nature, which is to provide a quote unquote foundation and location for all existence. So knowledge of the one is achieved through the experience of its power and its nature, which is to provide a foundation and location for all existence. So the power of the one is not a power in the sense of physical or even mental action. The power of the one, as Plotinus speaks of it, is to be understood as the only adequate description of the manifestation of supreme principle that, by its very nature, transcends all predication and discursive understanding. So even the fact that we could try to talk about it minimizes how immensely vast and transcendent it is. That even to try to have a discourse of understanding and try to have a conversation about it, we're missing it. Its power, its foundation of all things, and it is transcendent. There's no way to really talk about the one, but we're trying. So this power then is capable of being experienced or known only through, we're going to roll back here to the concept of contemplation, only through contemplation, which means to basically to speculate, meditate, think, to dwell on. So the power then is capable of being experienced or known only through contemplation or the purely intellectual vision of the source of all things. So the one transcends all beings, right? We've got that. And transcends means it's like not personable. It's not really knowable. It's so great, so vast that it sort of cuts through, like it pervades, all of existence. Like it is all, and it is in all. And then even that, to try to talk about it, it's more transcendent than to even acknowledge that it's transcendent. It's so transcendent, why are we even talking about it, right? I'm kidding. But, I mean, you sort of, at some point when you're talking about philosophy, you get to a point where you're like, hey, why are we even talking about it if it can't be talked about, right? But the one transcends all beings, and it is not itself an actual being, precisely because all beings owe their existence and subsistence to their eternal contemplation of the dynamic manifestations of the one. So basically, the one transcends all beings, all created beings, but it itself isn't really a being, because we owe our existence to this eternal contemplation of the dynamic manifestation of the one. But you kind of start to think, though, if the one is only there because we can conceive of the one, but we can't conceive of the one, it almost thinks that so if we didn't conceive of or contemplate the uncontemplatableness of the one, wouldn't the one just disappear? It's almost as if the one, in my opinion, seems to rest on or require us to contemplate its existence in order for it to exist. And again, if that's confusing, it's because it is. Okay, so the one can be said to be the source of all of our existence, yet it is somehow through our contemplation of the one that causes it to even be what it is. So the one can be said to be the source of all existence only insofar as everything in existence naturally and therefore imperfectly, because we're, flawed, contemplates the various aspects of this one, capital O, one, as they're extended throughout the cosmos in the form of either sensible or intelligible objects or created beings. The perfect contemplation of the one. Now, this is what you're really striving for. But the perfect contemplation of the one must not be understood as a return to a primal originating source or anything like that. The one is not, strictly speaking, a source or a cause, but rather the eternally present possibility or active making possible of all existence of being. So rather than thinking of the one as the source or the cause, as we would think in terms of God or an Aristotelian philosophy, or as Thomas Aquinas goes on to develop, the unmoved mover, the uncaused first cause. But rather, what we find here with Plotinus is he's kind of brought in this Eastern concept. It's a lot like, really, stuff you see in Hinduism with Brahman being God, is this, radically transcendent God. So really, Hinduism, ironically, is monotheistic to some extent, because even though there are all these other gods, there's Vishnu, there's, Shiva, there's Kali, and then other, hundreds of thousands, millions, or depending on your sources, gods. Those gods are really only avatars at the end of the day that kind of give us a focal point of worship and devotion, but they're not really Brahman. That Brahman is this vastly, immensely transcendent, God is in all things and everything. But Hinduism is strictly pantheist, so they believe God is in everything. But Plotinus doesn't really take the pantheistic route, as we just mentioned before, but he does give this transcendent, not the cause or source of all creation, but the active making possible of all existence, of being the one. Again, is that confusing? A little bit. According to Plotinus, the unmediated vision of the generative power of the one, to which existence or things that are existent are led by the intelligence, results in an ecstatic dance of inspiration, not in satiated, satisfied sluggishness, but for it is the nature of the one to impart fruitfulness to us, that as we contemplate the one, even as imperfectly as we try to, that it's in that place that this source of life and intelligence and vigor is tapped into. So the one, in its regal, indifferent capacity as undiminishable potentiality of being, permits both, this rapid, this intense contemplation and ecstatic kind of creative extension of us lesser beings. So these twin poles, between us and the one is the manifested framework of existence, which the one produces without any effort. That's just how the one works. So the one is difficult to understand. All of this explanation of what the one is and the one isn't really is to kind of take away the just simplistic definition that the one is God. Though the one is God. Honestly, if we, at least in our Western understanding, we just basically described a character of God that's difficult to explain. But in that you elevate this concept and idea of God so greatly that, God can't be known because God is so grand and so great, right? This is not anything like what you would experience in the Christian religion, where it's clear and clearly communicated that creation can know the God of Scripture. Same thing with the God of Judaism and the God of Islam. Really, if we're going to go that direction, which is still an Abrahamic religion, that Allah, there's some things about Allah that cannot be known and understood, but ultimately that He can be known and be devoted to. And you can talk about Allah, right? You can talk about Yahweh, Jehovah. You can talk about Jesus, who really, I guess if you were to look at it in a Christian sense, kind of brings all of the concept and idea of God into human form, into a knowable, understandable, walking, living, breathing kind of manifestation of God in human form, which is nothing like what we talk about here with the One, as you can clearly see. So the One itself is best understood as the center about which the framework of the cosmos is erected, created. It's the framework, the result of contemplative activity of the intelligence. The One is dependent upon the contemplative activity of its intelligent lesser beings. And that's confusing. So, but let's jump back. So that was to give you kind of a little bit of a touch and go on what Ficino would have done. And he was invested in developing a form of thought based on these writings of Plotinus. And Plotinus was a follower of the teachings of Plato, but he brought in some Eastern ideas. And so we see this kind of building here. Philosophically, this is the sort of thing that was underpinning the philosophical background of the Renaissance. Humanist scholarship encouraged Cosimo's politics as well. For one thing, as we've talked about in this class already, Aristotle had defined human beings as political animals. And the Roman orator Cicero had insisted that civic responsibility was the chief duty of citizens. Cosimo saw his patronage, especially insofar as church and state were linked, as activity for the good of God that would in turn benefit the city. So he saw all of his efforts as, in a sense, honoring God, and it had a direct correlation to the city doing well. So after Cosimo's death in 1464, his son Piero, who lived from 1416 to 69, follows in Dad's footsteps. He comes along championing the arts, supporting this Platonic academy, working to make Florence the cultural center of Europe. Piero dies, unfortunately, only 5 years after Cosimo. Piero's 20-year-old son, Lorenzo, who is pretty cool, we'll talk about him here, living from 1449 to 92, assumed responsibility for leading the family and the city. Now, his accomplishments were so great and varied that in his own time, he wasn't dubbed this after he was dead. He was given this title, living and breathing, as Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. So he sounds like a wrestler, Lorenzo the Magnificent, or some sort of odd superhero. But in fact, Lorenzo was just really that awesome during Renaissance Italy. So Lorenzo didn't have the money that his grandfather had, so he did not commission many works himself. He did see to it that artists and architects who came to Florence were hooked up by other patrons. So he was kind of a good middleman. He was a good networker. Lorenzo was an accomplished musician and poet, and he started the Medici Library. His agents retrieved large numbers of previously unknown classical works from Greece, Egypt, and even the Middle East, and added these texts to the library. A large workshop of copyists employed by Lorenzo guaranteed that these works were diffused across the European continent. So by the time of his death, Lorenzo had created the ideal humanist city, envied by all of Italy. As a young man, Lorenzo was tutored by Ficino, the guy who was building a philosophy based on Plotinus. Plotinus was based upon Plato and Eastern influences. The Platonic Academy was instituted by Cosimo. And so young Lorenzo comes along and he sits under Ficino, where he is trained. Lorenzo rebuilds the city actually rebuilds the University of Pisa and continues to support this Greek philosophy and literature in Florence at the Platonic Academy. Lorenzo's own circle of acquaintances included many of the greatest minds of the day. Lorenzo invited an unknown adolescent named Michelangelo Buonarroti to live in the Medici Palace. Also, he hobnobbed with the likes of Heinrich Isaac, the poet Poliziano, and the painter Botticelli, and the philosopher Pico della Mirandola. Now, we've kind of skirted the religious system. We've kind of gone into the humanism, the philosophy here. We've talked about the politics and the money. We're going to kind of dive into the Catholic Church that was going on at this time, in the time of Medici family. And we're going to talk about this really fascinating character by the name of Savonarola. Savonarola was a pre-Reformation reformer. I mean, if we were to really give him a title, he was trying to reform the church before the Reformation. And he had some interesting sort of results, I guess you could say. The artistic and humanistic Renaissance in Florence was a precursor to the same kind of activity that would go on to be seen all across Europe. So the financial and personal security of the citizens of the city-states led to new calls for nationhood. We had free thinking, riots breaking out, a rebirth of public address, some of which would shake the foundations of the church. In Florence, the spirit of independence would lead to the fall of the Medici. So the year 1492 saw Columbus sail out of the harbor at Genoa toward the New World, and the same year that Ferdinand and Isabella unite Spain and reinstitute the Inquisition and effectively exile and displace all the Jews who would not convert to Christianity. All the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. In the same year, it saw the 43-year-old Lorenzo de' Medici take ill and die. His son Piero II took over the family at the young age of 22, ill-equipped to handle the challenge he was about to face. In 1481, when Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar, failed as a preacher in his native city of Ferrara and several others, he moved to Florence. Now, at first, he was considered ill-mannered, plain-spoken, tactless, and coarse. But he has some really interesting things that happened in the time of his ministry that actually gained him quite a bit of popularity. So he was nonetheless not very popular, but he was made lector at the Church of San Marco, and he lived in its monastery. He gave sermons at the more important church, San Lorenzo, which these are both churches that were, restored through the power of the Medici family. But as he began to preach in San Lorenzo and at San Marco, people began to come from all around to hear him. More and more people came to hear him in a case of content overcoming rather mundane delivery. It wasn't so much that he was a great and excellent preacher, but it was the things that he was beginning to say. And like in Old Testament, kind of Jeremiah the prophet, he began to make these prophetic judgments against Florence as if it had become Sodom. Savonarola was appalled that in its attempt to imitate Athens, Florence tolerated discreet homosexual activity. He claimed that Plato and his pupil Aristotle were burning in hell because of their paganism. He was particularly appalled by the works of the deceased Donatello and this young Michelangelo. Soon he was allowed to preach in the city's main cathedral, and he drew even larger crowds. And it gets more intense. He is quoted as saying, "It is not I who preach, but God who speaks through me," he would often proclaim. He claimed that, he goes on to call on Florence to bring its laws into, alignment with the laws of God. And if his hearers don't repent, he was quoted to say, the sword of God would slay them. In one quoted place he says, "Repent, O Florence, while there is still time. Clothe thyself in the white garments of purification." He became known as a speaker of parousia, what the Greeks called words of unvarnished, hard-to-take truth. Savonarola's credibility increases, though, when he does this really interesting prophetic act and he predicts the death of the Pope and the King of Naples. So Pope Innocent the Third and the King of Naples, both of their deaths, Savonarola prophesied would happen. Savonarola also built a following of young people, kind of a born-again youth movement, almost evangelical, in comparison. Very interesting. He called for a new Puritanism, and he kind of said things that Martin Luther would go on to say 19 years later. Quoting here, we have Savonarola saying, "You Christians should always have the gospel with you. I don't mean the book, but the Spirit. For if you do not possess the Spirit of grace and yet carry the whole book, of what advantage is it to you? The true books of Christ are the apostles and the saints, and true reading consists in imitating their lives. Look today at the prelates. They are tied to earthly vanities. They love them. The cure of souls is no longer their chief concern." So here we have a guy who's talking a lot like what Martin Luther would go on to say in his criticisms of the church, even bringing the people back to a sola scriptura, scripture-only kind of practice of Christianity, which with Catholicism that, so much is considered canon outside of the scriptures alone, that would be very challenging to the Catholic Church as it was when Martin Luther does it, 20 years later. So he was foreshadowing Luther's tome, and when he refers to the new Pope Alexander VI of Spanish Borgia family as a devil presiding over a harlot church. Sounds a lot like Luther. In fact, Luther actually mentions Savonarola in his writings later on, and looks back to him and refers to him as a true reformer in his opinion. And if you don't know anything about Martin Luther the Reformer, don't worry, we cover that in this class here and a couple lectures later. So even the great philosopher Pico della Mirandola and Michelangelo became followers of this Dominican priest Savonarola. They went to his church. In fact, it was Mirandola who talked Lorenzo de' Medici into arranging the appointment of Savonarola as the prior of the Dominican order at the Church of San Marco in 1490. In 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici dies. Savonarola actually prophesied that as well, ironically. So he's got 3 confirmed predictions of death as he's been hailing there will be this great judgment to come to pass. This does great for his credibility. So his credibility becomes so great that he was able to rally the citizens of the city to invite the French to seize control and dispose of the Medici family. In November 1494, Piero de' Medici II was forced to flee Florence. He was soon followed by Michelangelo when the artist heard that the puritanical monk had condemned the artist's realistic paintings and sculptures. French King Charles VIII made Savonarola head of the new Florentine Republic. After praising Charles VIII as the savior of Florence, Savonarola demanded that his version of the new constitution be ratified. A Puritan government was formed. Savonarola declared himself dictator of Florence and led a children's crusade to collect all vanities. What they would do is they would have these bonfires in the public square. And so all the young people would go through the town and they would collect all of their, carnal, I guess, sort of things, their idols, their, candles, cards, ornaments, nude statues, indecent books, carnival masks, all kinds of things that they considered to be ungodly, as it were. They would bring them into the public square, and they would have these huge bonfires where they would burn all of their idols and books, which is kind of really interesting. If you look into the book of Acts, you see this sort of behavior take place in the early church where the people burned their books of magic in the streets. So, this was kind of this apostolic sort of, throwback to early, Acts church Christianity taking place at the same time of the Renaissance here under Savonarola. These bonfires in the main square have, taken on mythic proportions, and even the great painter Botticelli is said to have thrown his paintings of nudes into the fire, but Savonarola's reign was suddenly weakened when he was excommunicated by Pope Alexander VI and condemned for heresy. I could see why Pope Alexander didn't probably take much of a liking to being called a devil presiding over the harlot church, so he has his way excommunicating Savonarola, condemning him for heresy. The rule of Savonarola was undermined by the return of the plague and crops failing. Savonarola hides himself in this Medici library when he learned that the Florentine Senate had turned on him. He was found, though, and hanged in the main square with several of his followers on May 23rd, 1498. Then his body was taken down and burned in the same place where the vanities had been incinerated by this youth revival that would go through the streets collecting idols and whatnot. On Palm Sunday, May 23rd, in 1498, St. Mark's was attacked by a screaming mob, and Savonarola was arrested by the Florentine authorities, with two friars who were among his most ardent followers, Domenico and Salvestro, his two right-hand men. All three were cruelly tortured before being condemned as heretics and handed over to the secular arm by two papal commissioners. So on that morning of May 23rd, a crowd of Florentines gathered in the Piazza della Signoria, where a scaffold had been erected on a platform. There's a plaque to this day where you can go and see. So from the heavy beam dangled these three, as they were hung, and three chains to support their bodies while they were subsequently burned to ashes. Wood for the burning was heaped up below. Some of the crowd screamed abuse at Savonarola and his two companions, who were formally unfrocked and left in their under tunics with bare feet and their hands tied before their faces were shaved, as was the custom. It is said that a priest standing near asked Savonarola what he felt about his approaching martyrdom. He answered, "The Lord has suffered as much for me," and these were his last recorded words. Salvestro and Domenico were hanged first, slowly and painfully, but Savonarola climbed the ladder to the place between them. The executioner made cruel fun of him, and then apparently tried to delay his demise so that the flames would reach him before he was quite dead, but failed, and Savonarola died of strangulation at about 10 a.m. He was 40 years old. With the piles of wood below the scaffold set alight, the flames quickly engulfed these three dangling bodies, while a trick of the heat, allegedly, made Savonarola's right hand move so that he seemed to be blessing the spectators as he went up in flames. Some of them burst into tears, but others, including excited children, sang and danced delighted around the pyre and threw stones at the corpses. What little was left of the 3 Dominicans was thrown into the river Arno. And there you go. That's the interesting life and times of early Renaissance and Renaissance period in Italy, and the Medici family, the philosophy that was kind of underpinning a lot of the humanist movement, and then this wild reformer, fiery prophetic preacher who predicted the death of 3 powerful people, and then himself. I guess he didn't predict his own death, but anyway, so there you go. That's going to cover all the material necessary that I'll look at for chapters 14 and 15.